Hello viewers, Jason with Exploring History Together. Today we are at the Pine Grove Furnace State Park. I had thought that this was really just a POW camp, but as I dug into it, found out it was very rich in lots of more history than just that portion. And have with me today David Smith and Andre Weltman, who both work here with the park, volunteering. I'm going to let them be the experts today. They're going to tell us all about what's going on here and what has gone on here over the last couple hundred years. But let me let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm David Smith with Cumberland County Historical Society, and Andre Weltman is with
the Friends of Pine Grove Furnace State Park.
We're both volunteers. My job at the Historical Society deals with historic preservation, and that's how I got involved in the history of the site we're going to be talking about today. We like to start these tours here because if the Pine Grove Furnace iron industry had not been here, none of the rest of the story that follows would have happened. So it all begins here in the 18th century with the development of the iron industry. It grows to include about 60 square miles of forest. And the reason for that wasn't the iron, the reason for that was the trees, because it was charcoal that supplied the fuel for the furnace that we're seeing just the stack of immediately behind us. As the iron industry grew, it needed provisions for the men and the animals that worked the iron industry, so they began to acquire local farms. And one of those farms was Bunker Hill Farm, and that's the site of what eventually becomes a POW camp, CCC camp, and then a POW camp. Andre, do you want to add anything about the iron industry?
Just that it was from the time of the American Revolution to 1895, so exactly 30 years after the Civil War. And for almost all of that and a little past closing of the iron industry, the Camp Michaux site, as we call it today, was one of 5 farms that supported the workers, as David just explained.
We're going to fast forward now to the 20th century. The iron industry by that time had closed. There had been a brickworks here, and eventually this just becomes state park. The state acquires all this land that was originally owned by South Mountain Mining, including the farm that we're going to be going to in a few minutes. The Great Depression occurs, and one of the works programs that Franklin Roosevelt developed as part of the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And they were looking for sites that needed restoration. And what had happened with the iron industry was, because of cutting down all the trees around here, there was really need to bring the area back to the way it had been before the iron industry. So this site, the site of the farm where we'll be heading, was the first site on state-owned land in Pennsylvania that was selected for a CCC camp. But to get the CCC camp started, there were no buildings up there except a farmhouse. They brought the original CCC campers here. There was a railroad that ran right across the road from where we're standing right now. It was still in operation at that time. It was basically used to supply, to bring people out for the state park. But it was also functional enough to bring the original campers in. And the photo that Andre is showing shows the furnace in the background with a pavilion on top. And this right here is the dining tent that they set up, and then other tents where they would stay. And then eventually, once they were settled in and could function from here, they would walk the 2 miles up to the site of the farm and begin the development of the site up there. As soon as they had a mess hall built up there, they moved all of this up there. The sleeping tents and so on were moved up there, and we'll continue the story up there. Anything else you wanted to add, Andre? Okay.
All right, well, we're going to go and take a look and get the tour, and I hope you'll join us and enjoy the show. Here we go. So we are on a walk of the battlefield today.
We're now up at the site. We're literally standing in what was a 250-acre farm, which you would never believe it as you look around you right now. But it was a productive farm. It worked up into the 1920s. So from the 18th century up into the 1920s, there was work going on up here of an agricultural nature. That then closed, and it remained unused until the Civilian Conservation Corps came in. And what they found when they got here, which we'll look at in a minute, is the farmhouse, which is immediately behind where we're standing right now. Before we do that, I just want to point out two books that are available. One is the walking tour book, and that's basically what we'll be following today as we walk around. It's 30 numbered sites with explanation of what happened at each of those sites. One of the things that's challenging about doing a tour up here is that you're dealing with the farm and the CCC and the POW and the church camp all at the same time, because those sites overlapped as those various entities began to happen. The other is a book called The Secret War at Home. It was written by a master's level student at Shippensburg University. He covers the whole history of the site with a focus, because he was retired military, with a focus on the POW parts of the camp. So this is stop one. Andre is standing next to it, and we have added a few of these wayside markers to help provide an introduction to the camp. So this one shows a painting that was done while it was a POW camp. It was done by a German prisoner. These pictures are CCC, or this one is, and this one. This is what it looked like when it was a farm. Here's the gate to the POW camp. So you get a fairly good introduction to what the camp was all about. And this is church camp up in this upper corner.
So today, this property is part of the Michaux State Forest. A lot of folks think that we're standing in the state park, since they often, as we did, begin down at Pine Grove Furnace State Park. But this is part of the Michaux State Forest. And in recent years, the district forest staff have been working to control invasive plants and to restore more natural habitat. So as David said, this was a 250-acre farm, and much of that farmland is out this direction, which is mostly not where the historic ruins are once you get past the barn and farmhouse. But in particular, in this direction, they are restoring plants, putting in some very simple trails to new birding platforms, which hopefully will be open for public use within another year. And they are also good partners with those of us looking at the history side of things, which is more from here in the other direction. So we have both history and nature overlapping in the modern use. There are a lot of people who visit as more videos and other internet connections, as people become aware that this site exists. And we actually get several thousand people a year coming through. And I know that partly because I regularly stock the handout. If people don't have the walking tour or the book, The Secret War at Home, when they arrive here, maybe they'll grab one of these. So I know how many of these get taken. And this can be a very busy place during the summertime.
As Andre mentioned, the state forest folks are doing some additional work beyond the historical trail that we put in back in 2010. And this is a piece of what they'll be doing. This will be the beginning of a nature trail that will overlap slightly the historical trail. But the historical trail continues with the ruins of the farmhouse, which is immediately behind this kiosk. We're now standing at the farmhouse. It was here, of course, when the CCC folks arrived. We're not quite sure when it or the barn, which we'll be seeing shortly, were built, but certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, if not the end of the 18th century. It continued to be used right up through the POW and church camp years. We know it was used during the POW years because some of these structures, this was the front porch structure, the main house was behind. One of the German prisoners signed his name here in this concrete when it was fresh. Unfortunately, in the lighting, you can't see it right now. Let's see if I can see any of it.
See.
It says Eric John. It's just very lightly inscribed. In certain lights, it's as clear as it can be, but you can't see it here.
I do see some letters. It's very, very light to see, but I do see lettering in there. Interesting.
There's a website, and we'll give you the link, that a gentleman named Lee Schaefer maintains that has a lot of photographs. And it's one of the first things, if you Google Camp Michaux, you should find that as one of the first search engine hits. And I'm pretty sure that there are better images of some of the writing that just happened that today. It's a little hard to see.
One of the telling pieces that occurs here that this was a farmhouse are the flowers that still appear periodically as you walk around the old farmhouse site.
And there used to be some forsythia that became so thick and invasive that it was deliberately removed. But those indicators of the 18th, 19th century farm function, if you're ever walking in the woods, maybe you don't see any structures, but you suddenly see kind of in the middle of nowhere certain types of flowers, it's often a hint that it used to be a farm.
We just left stop 2, the site of the farmhouse. Now we're going to fast forward to what would be stop 3. We're not going to walk clear up there, but that's a church camp site. In the evenings, after they had their evening meal, all of the campers would walk in silence up to Vesper Hill and have their evening devotionals. And Andre has a picture of what Vesper Hill looked like back in the 50s and 60s.
It's hard to imagine, but that was all clear. And from just up the hill, they could see the ruins of the barn we're heading to next. And you can actually see that in the background of this photograph.
We're now at stop 4, and we overlap some of the POW history, and immediately behind us we have the 18th century barn. So it's a good example of the overlap that happens as you walk through this. But what you're seeing here on the ground are the bases of what were 6 guard towers during the POW era. And of those 6, 4, the bases of 4 still are in existence. And they follow just the standard military prisoner of war camp design that you would have found anywhere in the country. There were POW camps all over the country. The POW camp came here in 1943. By that time, of course, the CCC camp had closed at the beginning of the war, and there were lots of prisoners who were being returned to this side of the Atlantic as the war was being executed in Africa and Italy and other parts of Europe. Initially, this camp was supposed to be a regular POW camp where the prisoners would stay for the duration of the war. However, the real unique feature of this camp is it never opened as a regular POW camp, because at the same time as they were preparing this camp to receive prisoners, there was this need from the military intelligence service to have prisoners interviewed to find out if they had any kind of significant information to share with our military folks. So this camp was selected as an ancillary site to the main camp at Fort Hunt, just outside of Washington, and prisoners would be sent here then and be interrogated. They'd only be here for a short time, long enough to be interviewed and then sent on to another camp somewhere else in the country. The job of the interrogators here was to find out, number one, were they military or were they Navy? Number 2, were they officers or were they enlisted men? And number 3, were they pro-Nazi or just a regular German prisoner doing what a German soldier would be doing. Once they have segregated them into those 8 different categories, they would be sent somewhere in the country that matched that designation. Or if they felt they did have important information, maybe about how a submarine operated or how the German military was planning to execute various battlefield plans, they would then be sent back to Fort Hunt for more intensive interrogation. This is the second wayside panel that has been put up to help interpret the site, particularly if people don't have copies of the book with them. We just found this at a recent work day that I had up here for keeping the trails in good shape. We do that once a year, and discovered that there was a postcard that one of the participants brought that showed the entire farm. So there's the farmhouse. This is the part that was still standing when the CCC came here. What we never knew is that there was a 2-story section of the house. And then, of course, the barn, all that had been left as far as our memories were, was this wall of the barn. But here it clearly shows the full extent of how large that barn was.
Do you know when this picture was taken?
1913 is the time that the postcard was identified. And we had never seen it before. So he allowed us to copy that and make use of it in our interpretation of the site. One thing I failed to mention when we were down at the guard post is that was guarding compound 2. There were 2 compounds. According to the Geneva Convention, you had to have a separate compound for officers from enlisted men. Now, this was, as I said, was designed to be an internment camp, but it never opened as an internment camp. So it really didn't function much as a separate area for officers, because many more officers came in than could be housed in the single building that stood right here, about where our path is going here, in front of the barn. The second guard tower was over to my right. But this was compound 2 and was used. And I have talked with church camp counselors who stayed in that building, and it was divided up into individual rooms as opposed to the other barracks buildings, which were just standard military barracks, totally open.
So that's the building that was compound 2 right down here, and this is the barn. This is a 1946 map prepared just after the Army camp closed.
As I mentioned earlier, the first CCC camp in Pennsylvania was opened here in 1933 and remained open until, this says 41, technically it was open until February of 42. This sign was put up to commemorate the Civilian Conservation Corps in the late 90s, and it had gotten in very bad shape, so the people from Michaux State Forest took it down, restored it, and then brought it back and put this roof over to help protect it, so hopefully it will last a little longer. Young men who signed up to come to a CCC camp did a 6-month registration. At the end of the 6th month, they could renew for an additional 6 months, and then again and again. So technically, they could be here as long as 2 years. Most only stayed for the 6 months. While they were here, they were building roads, they were planting trees. In fact, they're often referred to as the Tree Army. They would be stay in the barracks that were built for them, and then would go out after their breakfast at the mess hall and do the work. The road that we drove up here on today was built by the CCC. It was not here when the CC campers originally came up here. They followed an old farm road up here, which is now the Appalachian Trail. Generally, they helped their families out by signing up for this program in a couple of ways. Number one, they weren't a drain financially on the family anymore. And number two, they were required to send 80% of their salary back to the family, because they didn't have anything to spend on their money on up here. There was nothing here. It was a little more open than it is now, but there were no stores or movie houses or things like that. They did occasionally take them into towns. They could go to the movies, they could go to dances. There were sports events that they could participate in. But most of the time they were working. And that was the whole goal of the program, was to provide work for them and training. So they got training on how to build roads and how to install electric lines and telephone lines and how to plant trees and so on. So it was a very successful program from the societal aspect at that time, with many families not being able to feed themselves. So here was a program that was helping with that whole issue in a couple of different ways. This is in some ways the most important site that's still visible, that can be looked at here at what we today call Camp Michaux. It was the Forestry building, and this is a picture of what it looked like. It was basically the running of the CCC camp. Here's where the decisions were made about what the work details were going to be, what equipment was needed, what equipment needed repair. All of those kinds of things would have been decided in this building. When the military took this over, they needed a place to do the interrogations. And that's what this became then. It was the Interrogation Center. And they totally revised the inside of it so that in addition to places for the interrogators to meet, these were the places where the interrogations actually took place. So they were wired for sound. Recordings could be done if important information needed to be recorded in that way. When the church camp took this over, it was an obvious place that they could have some of the senior counselors live. So this became called Michaux Lodge, and the people in charge of the camp for a particular week would then live in this building. The other advantage for the church camp was that it was a place that they could, and this is what it looked like during the church camp years. It was a place that could be rented out during the winter, so they had some income because it had its own furnace and bathroom and kitchen facilities. So it was a self-sustained kind of a building. In March of 1970, it had been rented out to a group, used it successfully, shut it down, but something happened with the furnace and it malfunctioned and it set the building alight. And this is the kind of building it was, so it didn't take long for it to burn. The caretaker, the year-round caretaker of the camp, lived right over here, but he couldn't get here in time with the fire engine to address the fire, so the building was consumed. And eventually it led to the closing of the church camp. The church camp went to the state and said, we want this building rebuilt, we really need it. Church camp said, you have the lease, you're in charge, you have to rebuild it yourself. And they went back and forth for 2 years and never could achieve an agreement. So in 1972, the church camp closed. The state could find no additional renters or lease holders for the camp. So in 1975, the camp was dismantled. They didn't bulldoze it. They dismantled it. They had an auction. The buyers came in. If you bought a building, you had to take it down and haul it away. And that is the closing of this site, other than what you see now as a ruin. Prior to the erection of the CCC marker that we looked at earlier, there was really nothing up here to commemorate the various pieces of the history that occurred. However, this was here, and we think this probably was poured in 1946 when the POW camp was being removed and the church camp was being created. It's difficult to read, however, we do have an enhanced view of what it actually said. It designates, obviously, POW. It says 3rd Service Command. The 3rd Army ran these camps. They didn't do the interrogations. They just ran the camp. They provided the food, the guards, all of that, transportation, all of that sort of thing. And then, of course, it says Pine Grove. We have never figured out what these things were. If they were military insignias of some sort, we simply don't know. We know this was not an official marker because the dates are slightly wrong. It didn't open until May of 43, and it closed in February of 1945. So this was someone's approximation of what those dates were when this marker was poured. This is the only surviving feature, well, one of two actually technically, of the CCC program when it was developed back in the 30s. There was no need for the CCC to have a fountain. It had nothing to do with the function of a CCC camp. But it was not atypical for CCC camps, wherever they were located in the country, to do creative things like this. So this is the creative example we have here at what was then called the Pine Grove Furnace CCC camp. It was not called Camp Michaux. And they creatively, in addition to the fountain, lined the concrete fountain with local stone, including quartz here, and decoratively then added from the furnace, the iron furnace, the blue slag. So you see lots of it over here on the center of the fountain. We do have one picture that shows water coming out of the fountain. The whole water system here at Pine Grove Furnace CCC camp, POW camp, and eventually the church camp is gravity fed. The stream that Tom's run that supplies the water is fed into a pump house, which is a little further on into the camp. It's then pumped up to the side of the mountain where there were holding tanks. And from the holding tanks, then it was gravity fed back down into the kitchens, the latrines, the shower rooms, and this fountain. Now we are also standing right outside of Compound 1, the main prisoner holding area. And one of the guard towers is immediately behind the fountain. And you can see the 4 concrete bases of that guard tower. So that's the 3rd one that is now visible. And there is a 4th one then up on the north end of the camp. Immediately across the main entrance road to the camp was the recreation building. It was built by the CCC. This is what it looked like. You can see it with the photo was actually taken behind the fountain. Oh, yeah. The trees that are now 75 feet tall had not been planted yet when this photo was taken about 1934. When the military took this over, they totally renovated the inside of the building, and this is what it looked like. They lined all those walls with mahogany that was brought from Hagerstown Fairchild airplane factory, and then they on the floor painted the Army star, and there's the 3rd Army symbol. When the church camp took it over, they also used it as their recreation hall, and by that time they were able to rescue some of the paintings that the Germans had left when the POW camp closed, and they had those pictures displayed on the walls of the recreation building. We now have several of those paintings at the Historical Society, and they are on exhibit there. We're now completely in the middle of the CCC camp, and this is the base of their flagpole, creatively made in the shape of a north-facing arrow, and it is correctly oriented to the north. The CCC established rows of rows of spruce trees throughout the camp, and this is probably one of the finer examples of those, and most of them are still standing. In many places we've lost them. One of the interesting things about this is, if we're not going to walk down there today, but if you walk down there, you'll find a manhole cover right in the middle of the walkway. So the sewage system runs underneath. A lot of people think when you come out to a site like this that you're going to do pit toilets, kerosene lanterns, but that wasn't the case here at all. It was a fully functioning water system, sewage system, electric system. It was a fairly sophisticated camp. That's why it was attractive to the military to take it over from the CCC, and for the church camp to take it over from the military when the time came for that. I'm now standing in the no man's land between the outer fence and the inner fence. So to my right is the prisoner area. Outside of here would be where the guards and other military folks would be doing their part of the work up here at the camp. We're now at the site of one of 2 log cabins that the CCC built for their senior staff. When the military took this over, this particular one of the 2 was where the commandant lived and had his office. It was right outside one of the guard towers. That's the 4th one now that is still in existence. There were 8 trustees that were assigned to Camp Michaux, in other words, or Pine Grove Furnace POW camp. They stayed the entire duration of the 30 months that the camp was open. One of them was assigned to Major Thomas, who lived here, and his name was Heinrich Backhaus, and he was a talented painter. He was the orderly for Major Thomas, but I think probably Major Thomas picked him because he was a talented painter, and he painted this painting of this building and the related guard tower. He also painted an overview of the entire camp. He was taken out under guard here in front of me on the mountainside, looking down on the camp. And for many years, this was the only view we really had of what the whole camp looked like. And then I was doing a presentation like this a few years ago to a group from, I think the Fish and Game Commission from Harrisburg. And they said, we think we have a map of this site. And they did. And it matches exactly. So Backhaus didn't miss anything when he did this painting.
So we are standing, as David said, next to the commandant's office, the log building that the CCC originally built and then was used by the Army commander. And one of the interesting things about this site is that it's actually pretty small. If you visit it today with all of the trees grown up, you can't see all the way across a few hundred yards. But in fact, during the Army era, during the prisoner of war era, the commandant's office and residence right here was just a few steps from the barbed wire and one of the guard towers. So the German compound is just past those trees. Looking out his window, I would assume that they could stare at each other. So here is one of those paintings by that German prisoner who was such a great artist, and it shows the building, and here's the tower, and this tower, actually, this one is actually that, right there, all that's left of it. And then beyond that, barbed wire, etc.
When the POW camp was created, they needed to create a second mess hall. They obviously couldn't have the prisoners come to where the guards were going to be eating. So they took one of the CCC barracks that we just walked through, added a T to it, and that's where the kitchen was. Immediately in front of the building was this mound of earth. And what we've learned through the historical record is that we're not sure if this was put up by the POWs or whether it was already here for the CCC, but in this flat area in front of the mound was an Army star made out of white gravel. And this is where the German prisoners would have their roll call every morning.
So here's the gate to let trucks in, a double gate, and the trucks could make deliveries to the German mess hall. And so this kitchen area is all that's left of the building today.
What also shows in the picture, these are some of the original CCC barracks. This one had been torn down because when they were creating a POW camp, they thought it was too close to the fence. And then when it became an interrogation camp, they rebuilt it. But you can also see the beginning of adding the additional row of barracks on the far end of the camp, which was basically empty when the camp first opened. So eventually there were 10 barracks buildings. This is the first of what were eventually 10 barracks buildings that were used by prisoners during the war. This was a CCC barracks, so it's simply converted for use by the military and then eventually by the church camp. You can't really see it very clearly because there's still so much growth, but each of these buildings was on like a terrace. There was one more up this way and 3 more down that way. So there was a stack of 5 of these barracks buildings in this area of the camp. When we get over beyond the latrines and bathhouses, there were another 5 barracks buildings over there. One of the remaining pieces from the CCC era are the yuccas. You can see one here immediately to my left. If you look closely at this picture leading up to the fountain, there are yuccas on either side of the walkway before you get to the spruce trees that have been planted along there, which are now, some of them 75 feet tall. Some of them have fallen down because they have reached the extent of their lifespan. We're now at stop 17. There's several features of the camp available here. One of the ones that I like the most are what we refer to are the steps to nowhere. That's a surviving CCC feature. Our guess is sort of like the fountain. They used it for training CCC campers on how to do masonry. So the camp, the steps are there. And this photo shows how it was used during the church camp era for taking photos of all the campers for that particular week. And we have tons of these photos. Most of them, they're standing here. Interestingly enough, they're sitting. We're standing on the base of something the church camp built, which was a pavilion that provided cover for rainy weather. The other thing that you can sort of imagine from here, and shift over to the map with Andre, on the left are the 5 additional barracks that were built, and that area, as you can see, is completely overrun. They're sometimes referred to as the Japanese barracks, and that's only technically true. They basically, throughout the 30 months the camp was open, housed German prisoners. But toward the end of 1940, or the later summer of 1945, the decision was made to bring Japanese prisoners here. The war in Europe was over. The focus on German prisoner interrogation was abating. And so they did separate the camp in half. They literally ran a fence right down through the middle of the camp. They erected another guard tower right about where we're standing. And they brought in what we have documented, 161 Japanese prisoners. There was room for 400, but we have no records to absolutely clarify that there were more than that here. They also took one of those barracks and made a third mess hall. So there were 4 for sleeping purposes, and the one at the bottom would have been the Japanese mess hall.
And of course, that's why there's a road so that you can have an army truck come in to bring supplies to the kitchen.
When the church camp opened in 1946, they created a swimming area down on Tom's Run. We'll see it a little bit later. However, the state decided in 1954 that because the water couldn't be treated, they needed to create a new swimming pool. And they created, this is what's left of what was the swimming pool. I'm standing on the deck of the control room, which is underneath here. This is the edge of the diving board. You can see the base of the second diving board, which was here. The lifeguard sat here, and here is a photograph of what it looked when it was in operation. Of course, when the camp closed in 1972, by 1975, the state forest folks came in and somewhat filled this in. But because it was a spring-fed pool, it didn't eliminate the water. So there's always water in here. Even in the driest times of the year, there's water.
So this is where we're standing, is in this corner of the former prison camp and then the church camp ripped out buildings.
This is access to the control room underneath that deck that we were just standing on. We have not exposed the steps. We're almost certain they're underneath here, and that's a goal to be achieved sometime in the future. This is the area that often people will come and see and make up what they think is an appropriate story for what went on here. Prisoners were never abused at Pine Grove Furnace POW camp. This wasn't built till 1954, so this is not the location where the supposed abuse took place.
Prisoners were very well treated.
This is the water source for drinking water at Pine Grove Furnace CCC. This dam was built by the CCC program, and it holds back an impound area of water that is then piped down to a pump house further along Tom's Run, and then, as I said earlier, piped up or pumped up to holding tanks on the mountainside and gravity fed back into the camp, to the kitchens, latrines, shower rooms, and so on. There is a feature over on the far wall that we'll look at, and evidence of German prisoners being here. In most prisoner of war camps, internment camps in the country, the prisoners are assigned work details. If it's an agricultural area, they'll work on farms. Some of the ones over in Gettysburg would work in the orchards. But Camp Michaux, because they were here such a short time, they generally weren't assigned work details until the end of the war. And then there's evidence that they did come out in work details and work on different areas of the camp. There was an example of that at the farmhouse. There's this example right here where a German prisoner wrote PW and then a German form of dating 22/5, 22nd of May, 1945. So that would have been after the war in Europe was over. And the other evidence we have of this type of thing seems to happen about that time, right in as the war in Europe has come to an end.
So here we are at the upper dam, and during the modern use, by which I mean in the 21st century, we have a lot of mountain bikers, hikers, people come through. And so crossing this waterway has been a problem. But there are concrete abutments left over from a road that ran around the edge of the camp to allow for security patrols and so forth. So in 2022, I designed and funded by the Friends of Michaux State Forest and by REI Company. We built this beautiful little bridge, and I say beautiful immodestly, it's quite nice. It is designed to allow mountain bikers to come through, but it's too narrow for ATVs, which should not be back in there. So this has improved the situation for visitors, I hope, replacing a somewhat rickety bridge that I put in 20 years ago that is really unsafe by comparison.
This is the lower dam on Tom's Run. It was, we think, well, we know that the bulk of it was built by the church camp. There's a possibility there was a smaller dam here that the CCC used as a recreation area. So this was the major water recreation area for the church camp from 1946 up to 1954. The state of Pennsylvania is in the process of removing dams that block the natural migration of fish, in this case, the brown trout. So this kiosk was put up to mark the history of this site, to show why the dam is no longer holding back a large amount of water. It's now basically a wetlands area, and they've diverted Tom's Run around the dam area. So there's a whole new channel that Tom's Run exists in. This is what it looked like when it was an active swimming area. The base of this diving board is still there. You can see the concrete wall. That area on the far side was a beach. We're going to be walking up in a moment to the mess hall. It's just above here. And there's what it looked like as a CCC mess hall. Heavily modernized by the military when they came in here, but it's the largest building on the compound. This is the base of the pump house where that water from the upper dam would be brought. The pumps sat on those foundations. The water would have been held in this holding tank and then pumped up to the holding tanks on the side of the mountain. This is the mess hall as it was renovated by the military. This concrete structure here is just the kitchen and the loading dock area. The main building was behind it, the largest building on the campus, and could easily accommodate all of the campers during the church camp era. They were walking past what was the recreation building during the CCC era. It was a fairly basic structure. The military, as I mentioned earlier, heavily modernized it. The church camp continued to use it. I'm going to go down these steps to what was the patio area. And we have some really good pictures of military men, guards, out here relaxing during some time off in this flat area. And then we're going to walk over to a CCC building. In 1934, as the CCC program was being developed, they realized that many of these men who were campers did not have much of an educational background, and they decided to add an education component. So this barracks building was converted to a school, and they used this keystone design as a step up into the building, and then they ran all kinds of education programs through this building. It was run by seniors, graduating seniors from what was then Shippensburg State Teachers College, now Shippensburg University, and initially just basic education programs, reading, writing, arithmetic, that sort of thing. But they eventually got fairly sophisticated, and it was possible to earn your GED if you stayed in the camp long enough, more than just one term, and took enough of the courses. Some of the higher level courses emphasized business, so they would have typing and stenography and those kinds of skills that they'd be teaching. We're standing on the Michaux Road, what was then High Mountain Road Bridge, this being a road that was built by the CCC. A smaller bridge came across Tom's Run at that time, and then we believe during the military era, the POW era, the bridge was widened. And so the structure we're looking at now is the widening of the bridge. And one of the German prisoners, he identified himself as Lieutenant Momberg, was apparently assigned work detail to work here probably in May or June of 1945. And he not only gives us his name, he says he's a prisoner of war, he says he's German, he indicates his entire prisoner number and where he lived in northern Germany. And he also had some connection with what is now the Prague Republic, because he also signs Prague as part of his writing, the inscription that he put here on the bridge. One of my volunteers, who's very into doing in-depth research, wrote to Germany, found out what his record was as a German military person. Of course, lieutenant would not be the term they used. They used a word that was Obert, was the correct name for someone in that level of the military in the German military. We're concerned about this because it's obviously shuffling away, and we're concerned that eventually we're going to lose this. So thank goodness we have it well documented in photography.
Well, guys, I want to thank you very much for the time you spent with me today, showing me the sites here and all the talking about all the history and giving you a chance to tell the history as it really is. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you for your time, David. And
thank you, Jason.
It was a pleasure.
And
looking forward to seeing the video.
Yeah,
very good.
Anxious to see
well,
how you pull it all together.
It'll be a few days in editing, but viewers, if you want to come up here and see Pine Grove Furnace for yourself, please make the trip. These guys are doing great work in here. There's a lot going on, a lot of work yet to be done, but as they've told me over the past year, a lot of the stuff that is now visible today wasn't visible at all a year ago. So they're doing the work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.